This is Boston's first Civil War monument, built at around 1881 here on Boston Common. And it's the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, the monument to the soldiers and sailors from Massachusetts who served in the Civil War. And we have around the base these bas-reliefs showing different scenes of Massachusetts in the war. The first one shows a Massachusetts regiment leaving. They're marching past the State House. The governor is presenting them with their regimental flag or their colors as the troops march down Beacon Street to Long Wharf to take them to the battlefront. The Massachusetts State House, with its central doors, the only 3 times those doors will open are when a regiment is either leaving or returning. When they return their colors, or when a visiting head of state comes to Boston, the doors open, or when a governor leaves office. And by tradition, the governor leaves office, walks down the steps onto Boston Common, blends into the crowd, and becomes a civilian. So this regiment is preparing to leave. They're getting their regimental flag from the governor and marching down Beacon Street off to fight the Civil War. President Lincoln wanted the Civil War to be the first war in modern times in which there were fewer deaths from camp disease and sickness than there were on the battlefield. So he created the Sanitary Commission, the United States Sanitary Commission, a team of doctors and nurses and volunteers who would roll bandages, tend to the wounded, and also keep the cleanliness in the camps. And he appointed Samuel Gridley Howe of Boston, the proprietor of the Perkins School for the Blind, to head the Sanitary Commission. Now, Howe and his wife, Julia Ward Howe, were both avid abolitionists. They had a magazine called Commonwealth, an anti-slavery magazine. John Brown had visited them at their home in South Boston. When the war began in April of 1861, they were overjoyed because they knew the war would end slavery. Then on the 19th of April of 1861, the first Massachusetts troops going to the defense of Washington, marching through Baltimore, were attacked by a Baltimore mob. A number of them were killed. Their bodies were brought back, and there was a funeral for them at King's Chapel. Julia Howe and her husband went to the funeral, and they were struck by the flag-draped caskets. They realized that this war they had helped to start, the war whose beginning they had welcomed, was going to cause a lot of deaths, and they were not going to be among the casualties. Other people would die in this war. It was a sobering thought for Mrs. Howe and for her husband. Now, as the troops were training out in the Harbor Islands in the spring of 1861, one thing troops do when they're training, when they're marching, is they make up songs to sing to help keep the cadence. There was a popular tune at the time, "Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore? Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore? Brother, will you meet me on Canaan's happy shore?" Popular song. Now, in one of the camps on George's Island, one of the men made up new words to it. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave. His truth is marching on. John Brown had been executed by the United States government for his attack on Harper's Ferry in 1859. John Brown was not considered a hero by the United States government, and at this time the United States government was fighting a war not to end slavery, but to save the Union. So these Massachusetts troops were forbidden to sing the John Brown song. In the fall of 1861, Mrs. Howe and her husband went to Washington. He was to set up the Sanitary Commission. And Mrs. Howe, all along the route to Washington, was struck by this mobilization, the young men marching off to war, the industrial mobilization to support the war effort. And they get to Washington, and she speaks to some of the Massachusetts troops. She sees the troops exercising, practicing outside of Washington. And she and her friends, as they're marching back to Washington one fall day in 1861, they sing to help the troops keep their spirits up. And one of the songs they sing is John Brown's Body. The troops are not allowed to sing this song, but when they hear these women from Massachusetts singing it, they cheer. Good for you, they say, because they know the war is about slavery. That night, Mrs. Howe can't sleep. She gets up at about 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, because a poem has come to her. Mrs. Howe liked to write poetry. Her husband thought writing poetry was a silly thing, so she never did it when he was awake, meaning she could write poetry in the dark. She found a piece of hotel stationery and she wrote her poem. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. He is trampling out the vintage where the grapes of wrath are stored. He has loosed the fateful lightning of his terrible swift sword. His truth is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah, glory, glory, hallelujah, glory, glory, hallelujah. His truth is marching on. I have seen him in the watchfires of 100 circling camps. They have builded him an altar in the evening dews and damps. I have read his righteous sentence by the dim and flaring lamps. His truth is marching on. He has sounded forth the trumpet that shall never call retreat. He is sifting out the hearts of men before his judgment seat. Be swift, my soul, to answer him. Be jubilant, my feet. Our God is marching on. In the beauty of the lilies, Christ was born across the sea, with a glory in his bosom that transfigures you and me. As he died to make men holy, let us die to make men free. His truth is marching on. She gets back to Boston and she gives the poem to her friend who publishes the Atlantic Monthly, and in the February 1862 issue it is on the cover with the title, The Battle Hymn of the Republic. President Lincoln loves this song, and it becomes the unofficial national anthem for the United States, and also the song that will win the Civil War, transforming this war about the Union into a war about slavery, as both, we see by 1862, are inseparable. We have the statue of the sailor here, and here a depiction of the sailors leaving, saying goodbye to their loved ones, and here we see the battle. We see a ship firing, and also a monitor, a real innovation in naval technology developed during the Civil War. A low-lying boat with a swiveling turret that can demolish anything bigger in the water. So this side depicts the role of the Navy in the Civil War. An important role here, as many of the monitors and ironclads were built here in Boston, and as Boston continued to produce great sailors for the Union Navy. Each corner of the monument features a different statue representing a different facet of the war and of history. We have a soldier and a sailor on opposite corners, and then Victory and the Muse of History on this corner, recording the deeds of these men who had served. And at the very top, we see a statue of Liberty, the 19th century representation of liberty, with her laurel wreath in one hand, the flag in the other, the eagles around the base, looking out over the Union. She is facing south, facing toward the rest of the country, as well as the Confederacy, now incorporated back into the Union. So a wonderful Civil War monument, a representation of the memory of the Civil War when it was still fresh in the minds of Bostonians.